What purchasing power was like among ancient Egyptians in the New Kingdom era? What purchasing power was like among ancient Egyptians in the New Kingdom era? A question most people have never even thought to ask. And yet, the answer reveals something extraordinary about the human condition. Imagine waking up every morning, walking to work under the scorching desert sun, carving stone for hours on end, and at the end of the month, instead of coins or bills, someone hands you sacks of grain. That was the reality for millions of people living along the Nile over 3,000 years ago. And here is the part that will surprise you. That grain was not just food, it was money. It was power. It was survival. And the way ancient Egyptians used it to buy, sell, negotiate, and even cheat each other is a story that has never been told quite like this. This is not the Egypt of golden pharaohs and towering pyramids you have seen in movies. This is the Egypt of ordinary people, craftsmen, farmers, merchants, and scribes, navigating an economy that, despite having no coins, no banks, and no paper currency, was shockingly sophisticated. The New Kingdom, stretching roughly from 1550 to 1070 BCE, was Egypt at its absolute peak. Pharaohs like Thutmose III, Hatshepsut, and Ramesses II ruled over an empire that stretched from modern-day Sudan to Syria. Wealth poured into the kingdom from conquered lands and bustling trade routes. Gold flowed from the mines of Nubia. Cedar would arrive from the forests of Lebanon. Lapis lazuli traveled thousands of miles from the mountains of Afghanistan. Incense drifted in from the mysterious land of Punt. Egypt was a global superpower, and the economy that sustained it was far more complex than most people realize. But what did that wealth actually mean for the people living under those rulers? What could an average Egyptian buy with a day's work? How did they negotiate prices when there were no price tags, no shop windows, no fixed rates? And what happened when the system that fed them broke down entirely? To answer those questions, we need to travel to a small village tucked into the cliffs on the west bank of the Nile, near modern-day Luxor. The village was called Setmiot, which translates roughly to the place of truth. Today, archaeologists know it as Deir el Medina, and it is one of the most important archaeological sites in the world, not because of grand temples or royal tombs, but because of the thousands of limestone flakes and pottery shards found there, covered in writing. These fragments, called ostraka, are essentially the receipts, letters, complaints, and shopping lists of ordinary Egyptians. They give us an astonishingly detailed window into daily economic life that no other ancient civilization has left behind in such abundance. The village housed the workers and artisans responsible for building and decorating the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These were not slaves, a common misconception that persists to this day. They were skilled laborers, among the most valued in the entire kingdom, painters who could render the gods with breathtaking precision, sculptors who carved hieroglyphs so perfectly they seemed printed rather than chiseled, plasterers who prepared surfaces as smooth as glass, and draftsmen who designed elaborate compositions depicting the pharaoh's journey through the underworld. These men were employed directly by the state, and the state paid them not in gold, not in silver, in grain. Every month, each worker received a set ration, measured precisely and recorded by scribes. A senior craftsman might receive 4 sacks of emmer wheat and 1.5 sacks of barley. A junior worker received less. The grain was distributed from royal granaries under the watchful eyes of administrators who kept meticulous records. It was their salary, their pension, and their purchasing power all rolled into one. But grain alone could not sustain a full life. A man needed sandals to protect his feet from the burning sand. His wife needed linen for clothing, the light, breathable fabric that was the universal garment of ancient Egypt. His children needed oil for their skin in the dry desert air, protection against the relentless sun that cracked and aged exposed skin within years. The family needed vegetables, onions, garlic, leeks, and lettuce were staples. They needed fish from the Nile, beer that served as both beverage and nutrition, and occasionally meat for special occasions. They needed furniture, tools, pottery, and even cosmetics. Coal eyeliner was not vanity, but a practical necessity that protected the eyes from the sun's glare and infections carried by desert flies. Since the state only provided grain, everything else had to be acquired through trade, not with distant merchants, but with their own neighbors, right there in the village. The marketplace of Deir el-Medina was not a grand bazaar with colorful awnings. It was a network of personal exchanges, negotiations held in doorways and courtyards. Deals struck between people who had known each other for years and would continue to live side by side for decades. Trust mattered more than anything. Reputation was currency. And every single transaction was measured against a standard that most people today have never heard of: the deben. The deben was not a coin. You could not hold it in your hand the way you hold a dollar or a euro. It was a unit of weight, roughly equivalent to 91 grams, about the weight of a small apple. Originally tied to copper, and later to silver and gold as the economy grew more complex. The deben served as a universal reference point for value. Think of it as an ancient price tag system that allowed entirely different goods to be compared on equal terms. A goat might be worth 1 or 2 deben of copper. A cow could cost anywhere from 20 to 50 deben depending on its age and health. A simple wooden bed might be valued at 12 to 15 deben. A jar of quality honey could fetch half a deben. A pair of well-made leather sandals might cost 1 or 2 deben. But nobody walked around carrying lumps of copper on a scale. The deben was an abstraction, a way of comparing value so that people could trade different goods fairly. A woman could trade a jar of honey valued at 1 deben for a pair of sandals also valued at 1 deben, and neither party needed to touch a single piece of metal. The deben made barter intelligent, and that intelligence is what made the entire economy function across an empire of millions. Now that we understand the deben, the question becomes, what did everyday life actually look like when it came time to buy something? The records from Deir el-Medina paint a picture so vivid it feels like eavesdropping on conversations that happened 3 millennia ago. These are not dry administrative records. They are snapshots of real human drama, negotiations, argument, and sometimes outright dissent. Consider a man named Mena. He was a draftsman, one of the artisans responsible for sketching the outlines of elaborate scenes that would be painted inside the royal tombs. Mena earned his grain ration faithfully each month. But one day, according to the ostraka found at the site, he decided he wanted something unusual, a coffin. Not for himself, not yet anyway, but for his elderly mother, who was growing frail and whose breathing had become shallow in the cold desert nights. In ancient Egypt, preparing for death was not morbid. It was an act of love, a sacred duty that defined a family's honor. A well-made coffin was one of the most important purchases a family could make, because it was believed to protect the body for all eternity. Mena approached a colleague named Kaha, who was known in the village as a skilled woodworker, a man whose hands could shape imported sycamore and acacia wood into objects of genuine beauty. Kaha agreed to build the coffin, but the price was steep, 25.5 deben of copper in total value. Mena did not have 25 deben worth of copper sitting in his home. Almost nobody did. So the transaction became a complex negotiation of goods that probably unfolded over several days. According to the Ostrakon that recorded this deal, Mena paid Kaha with a combination of items: a pig valued at 5 deben, 2 sacks of grain worth another 5 deben, several jars of fat and oil worth 4 deben, and a collection of smaller items including woven baskets, reed mats, and jars of honey that made up the rest. Each item was carefully assessed, its value debated, and the total calculated against the agreed price. The exchange probably took days, maybe weeks, as Mena gathered what he needed from his own stores and perhaps traded with other villagers to acquire specific items Kaha wanted. And every step was witnessed and sometimes recorded. Because in a village where everyone knew everyone, your word was your bond, and a broken deal could ruin you socially for the rest of your life. This was how the economy worked at the ground level. It was personal, relational, and deeply rooted in mutual accountability. There were no courts to enforce contracts for everyday trades. Instead, disputes were brought before a local council of workers and elders called the Kenbet. The Kenbet met regularly, often at the entrance to the village or near the local shrine, and its decisions carried the weight of collective authority. If you cheated someone, if you promised a jar of honey and delivered watered-down beer instead, the Kenbet would hear the case, witnesses would testify, and the entire village would know about it within hours. Social pressure was the enforcement mechanism. In a community of perhaps 60 families living in narrow, mud brick houses with shared walls so thin you could hear your neighbor's arguments, reputation was everything. A man known as dishonest would find it increasingly difficult to trade with anyone, which in an economy based entirely on personal exchange was a devastating punishment, a kind of economic exile without ever leaving home. But the system was not perfect. The Ostraka also revealed darker stories, disputes over debts that festered for months, accusations of theft that split families apart, and bitter arguments about the quality of goods exchanged. One record tells of a woman who lent a quantity of grain to her neighbor with the clear expectation of repayment at harvest time. When the neighbor failed to pay, claiming the harvest had been poor and she had nothing to spare, the woman brought the case to the Kenbet, demanding not just the original grain but additional compensation for the delay and the hardship it had caused her own family. The Kenbet ruled in her favor. Interest, it turns out, existed long before banks did, born not from financial theory, but from the simple human recognition that delayed payment costs the lender something real. Another document describes a man who sold a donkey, an enormously valuable animal in the desert, worth perhaps 30 deben, only to have the buyer claim the donkey was sick and demand a full refund. The ensuing argument dragged on for months. with witnesses called from across the village and testimony recorded on pottery shards that survive to this day. What is remarkable about all of this is not just the detail, but the sophistication. These were people living in a world without money as we understand it. Yet they had developed a system of pricing, credit, debt, dispute resolution, and even consumer protection that would be recognizable to anyone navigating a modern marketplace. They understood inflation too, intuitively, from lived experience rather than textbooks. When grain supplies ran low, whether due to drought, poor harvests, or disruptions in state distribution, the purchasing power of grain went up relative to other goods. Suddenly, a sack of emmer wheat could buy more sandals, more oil, more beer. And when grain was plentiful after a generous Nile flood, its value dropped, and it took more grain to buy the same jar of honey. The workers of Dia El Medina experience the same economic forces that drive headlines today. Beyond the village, the economy operated on multiple interconnected levels. The state controlled the largest flows of wealth: grain from royal estates, gold from Nubian mines, tribute from conquered territories. Pharaoh was the wealthiest entity in the kingdom, and the temples were close behind. The Temple of Amen at Karnak owned hundreds of thousands of cattle, millions of sacks of grain, hundreds of ships, and enormous quantities of gold and silver. The temple was not just a place of worship. It was a corporation, a bank, and a government agency all in one. For ordinary Egyptians, this upper economy was experienced indirectly through rations from state granaries and tools from state workshops, and the occasional chance to acquire something special at a market held near the temple gates. The economic system of the New Kingdom worked remarkably well for centuries, but it depended on one crucial element that everyone took for granted until it disappeared. The state had to keep its promises. The workers of Dia El Medina, those master craftsmen who carved and painted the tombs that pharaohs believed would carry them into eternity, were paid by the government. Their grain rations arrived on schedule, month after month, year after year, delivered from royal granaries that were supposed to be endlessly replenished by the vast agricultural wealth of the Nile Valley. For generations, the system held. Fathers told their sons that the rations would always come, just as the Nile would always flood. It was as certain as the sunrise. And then, during the reign of Ramesses III, around 1170 BCE, something happened that would echo through the ages. The first recorded labor strike in human history. The papyrus, known today as the Turin Strike Papyrus, tells the story in the workers' own voices, recorded by their scribes with an urgency that transcends the millennium. The rations had not arrived. Not for 1 month, not for 2 months. The workers waited, growing increasingly anxious. They sent messages to administrators, polite at first, then desperate. Their families were hungry. Children cried for bread. Wives stretched the last reserves of grain into thin porridge that barely sustained them. The workers had no grain to eat, no grain to trade, no purchasing power whatsoever. The economy of the village, entirely dependent on that monthly payment, ground to a complete halt. A man could not buy oil for his lamps because he had nothing to offer. A woman could not trade for fish because the fishermen had nothing to buy with their catch. A potter sat with shelves of vessels nobody could afford. The entire web of interdependent exchange that sustained the community simply froze. like a river suddenly turned to stone. And so the workers did something unprecedented, something that required extraordinary courage in a society where Pharaoh was considered a living god. They put down their tools. They marched out of the Valley of the Kings, abandoning the most sacred construction project in the kingdom, and gathered at the mortuary temples on the edge of the cultivation. "We are hungry," they declared to the officials who came to negotiate. 18 days have passed in the month, and we have not received our rations. The officials scrambled, caught between workers who had nothing left to lose and a treasury hemorrhaging resources. Partial payments were made. A few sacks of grain here, a delivery of oil there, but the underlying problem persisted. The state treasury was under immense strain. Ramesses III was fighting the Sea Peoples, a coalition of maritime raiders devastating the eastern Mediterranean, toppling kingdoms and burning cities. The military demanded resources. The temples demanded resources. The construction of Ramesses III's massive mortuary temple at Medinet Habu demanded resources. And somewhere at the bottom of the priority list, the workers carving the pharaoh's eternal tomb were left waiting, their families growing thinner with each passing week. The strikes happened not once but several times during the later years of Ramesses III and his successors. Each time, the pattern repeated: delayed rations, growing desperation, collective action. Temporary resolution, then the slow slide back into crisis. Purchasing power declined not because grain changed in value, but because the system that distributed it was breaking down from the inside. Corruption made everything worse. Administrators skimmed grain from rations before they reached the workers. Others diverted supplies to the black market. The Ostraka from this period contain angry letters and formal complaints about dishonest overseers. Documents that read like modern whistleblower reports. What these workers experienced was an economic crisis driven by institutional failure, disturbingly familiar to anyone who has lived through a recession, a government shutdown, or a currency collapse. Their purchasing power vanished, not because goods ceased to exist, but because the mechanism connecting labor to goods was no longer reliable. Purchasing power has never been just about what things cost. It is about the systems, institutions, and relationships that allow exchange to happen in the first place. When those systems fail, no amount of individual skill can compensate. During this instability, workers adapted with remarkable resilience. Some took side jobs, crafting amulets, jewelry boxes, and furniture for wealthier customers. Others rented out their donkeys for transport work. Women brewed extra beer and baked bread, selling the surplus to travelers. The village became more entrepreneurial out of necessity, birthing small businesses from institutional failure. There were darker adaptations too. Tomb robbery increased dramatically. Workers who built the royal tombs knew exactly where treasures were hidden and how to bypass. Security they themselves had installed. The tomb robbery papyri record the trials of accused men. One confession describes a group breaking into a pharaoh's tomb under cover of darkness, stripping gold from the royal mummy, burning the coffin to melt remaining gold leaf, and dividing the spoils. The value was enormous, hundreds of deben, more than a lifetime of honest wages. For a worker whose monthly ration was worth 10 to 15 deben, and who had watched his children go hungry, the temptation was overwhelming. Authorities responded with harsh punishments, including beatings and execution. But the widespread robbery tells us something profound. When the legitimate economy fails, when the social contract between rulers and ruled is broken, people further away, some create, some criminal. The New Kingdom Egyptians were no different from any other society in this regard. As the New Kingdom slowly declined through the reigns of the later Ramessid pharaohs, the economic system that had sustained one of the greatest civilizations in human history transformed in ways both predictable and surprising. The purchasing power of ordinary Egyptians continued to fluctuate, shaped by harvests, wars, political stability, and the eternal unpredictability of the Nile's annual flood. That miraculous rising of waters that deposited rich black silt across the farmland and determined whether the coming year would bring abundance or famine. But the fundamental principles that had governed their economy, the deben as a unit of account, grain as a medium of exchange, and personal relationships as the foundation of trust, persisted for centuries. Even as Egypt eventually adopted coinage under Greek and then Roman influence, the deeply rooted habits of barter, negotiation, and community-based exchange forged over millennia did not disappear overnight. In remote villages along the Nile, the old ways survived long after the first coins began to circulate in the cities. What makes the economic story of New Kingdom Egypt so endlessly fascinating is not its exoticism, but its familiarity. Strip away the hieroglyphs, the temples, and the desert sand. And what remains is a story about people, just people, trying to get by. The workers of Deir el-Medina worried about the same things that keep people awake at night today. Whether their pay would arrive on time, whether they could afford what their families needed, whether the people they traded with were honest, whether the government was managing the economy competently, and whether the future would be better or worse than the present. They experienced inflation and deflation, boom and bust reform. Try. They invented credit, practiced lending with interest, haggled over prices, and took their disputes to court. They built networks of mutual support and obligation that functioned as a social safety net, looking out for widows, caring for the sick, and lending grain to neighbors who had fallen on hard times. And when the system failed them, they organized, protested, and demanded justice. 3,000 years before the concept of labor rights had a name. Consider for a moment what it meant to live in a world without money as we know it. There were no ATMs, no bank accounts, no credit cards, no digital wallets, no cryptocurrency. Every transaction required a personal interaction, a face-to-face negotiation, a mutual assessment of value conducted by two human beings looking each other in the eye. When a woman in Deir el-Medina wanted to buy a new linen garment, she could not simply walk into a shop and hand over coins. She had to find someone who had the garment she wanted, determine what that person needed in return, assess whether she had something of equivalent value to offer, and negotiate the terms with the skill of a diplomat. If she did not have the right goods, she might need to make a separate trade first to acquire something the garment seller wanted. A single purchase could involve a chain of 3 or 4 separate transactions, each requiring trust, patience, and social intelligence. Shopping in ancient Egypt was not a quick errand. It was a complex social performance that tested relationships, negotiation skills, and reputation in equal measure. And yet, the system worked. It worked for centuries, across an empire that at its height was one of the largest, most powerful, and most culturally rich on Earth. It fed families, built monuments that still astonish us today, equipped armies that conquered vast territories, and sustained a culture of extraordinary artistic and intellectual achievement. The purchasing power of an ancient Egyptian measured not in abstract currency units, but in sacks of grain, jars of oil, lengths of linen. And the trust of their neighbors was real, tangible, and deeply human. It reminds us that money, in whatever form it takes, whether grain or gold or green paper or digital numbers on a screen, is ultimately just a tool for organizing human cooperation. The coins and bills and digital transactions we use today are more efficient than sacks of grain. But they serve exactly the same purpose they served on the dusty streets of Deir el-Medina, allowing people to exchange their labor, their creativity, and their resources in pursuit of a better life. The sands of Egypt have preserved many things across the millennia. Temples of staggering grandeur, tombs painted with scenes of heartbreaking beauty, statues that capture the human form with timeless grace, and scrolls that record prayers, poems, and stories of gods and heroes. But perhaps the most remarkable things they have preserved are those thousands of small limestone flakes and broken pottery shards from Deir el-Medina, covered in the everyday handwriting of ordinary people, recording ordinary transactions. A receipt for a coffin purchased with a pig and some honey. A complaint about late wages that sounds like it could have been written yesterday. A record of a donkey sale gone wrong that dragged on for months. A love poem scribbled on the back of a work order during a slow afternoon. These fragments are not the voice of pharaohs or gods. They are the voice of working people, speaking to us across 30 centuries about the timeless, universal, deeply human business of getting by, of providing for the ones you love, of making do with what you have and hoping for something better tomorrow. Purchasing power in the New Kingdom was not measured by the weight of gold in a pharaoh's treasury or the height of the obelisk's at Karnak. It was measured by a craftsman's ability to feed his family, honor his dead, and maintain his dignity in a community where everyone knew his name. It was measured by a woman's ability to brew beer, trade it for linen, and clothe her children against the cold desert nights. It was measured by the collective power of workers who, when the system betrayed them, had the courage to stand together and say, "We are hungry, and we will not be silent." That is the true story of purchasing power in ancient Egypt, and it is a story that, in many ways, has never ended. It continues in every paycheck earned, every price negotiated, every act of solidarity between workers, and every family sitting down to dinner, wondering if there will be enough.